crimp edges and bake at 375. Hey, Emery, do you know what crimp means?
Like pinch?
Okay, I'm confused.
Can I see? Ah, you gotta click load images.
Beautiful. I should have just looked for an image series.
I don't know. I think that the best recipes combine the most useful parts of images and text. Like, pictures can show the detail of what you're doing, but you need words to show stuff like duration or temperature. Communication is much more multimodal than we tend to think it is. Like, when you talk to someone, you don't just process what they're saying, but also things like their facial expression or tone.
True. And it's not like we're interpreting words and facial expressions as two separate languages. But our brains combine both into single, larger chunks of meaning that we experience all at once.
Sign languages make great use of that fact. Like, some adjectives are expressed with the speed or intensity of a sign, rather than through their own unique gesture.
Now I'm thinking about this text I got from Io the other day. In linguistic terms, I kind of automatically find an overarching connection or coherence between all parts of a message. In this case, that's a causal relationship. I immediately infer that Io was going to be late because he got a flat tire.
Well, I'm glad my suffering could be a teachable moment.
You need a new tire, dude. This keeps happening.
It blows my mind that we find that coherence so automatically. Like, we know how two pieces of a story connect or how two shots of a film connect without even thinking about it. My friend Malihe and her colleagues are actually currently working on a catalog of the different relationships between images and text, but it's not like they're inventing those relationships. They're just trying to categorize the ones that we already unconsciously know and use.
Yeah, but isn't their work all about getting artificial intelligence to caption images for us? I feel like that's just asking for some problematic mistranslations.
Actually, I think that their work shows that we can use AIs to not only generate captions that are accurate, but inclusive.
Okay, hold on a second. I'm still on this automatically inferring coherence thing. How can we ever know what someone else's intentionality is? Like, I could make a connection between a word and an image. But the person who put them together maybe was trying to communicate something totally different.
Great question. And I think that computational linguistics has some beautiful answers. So when we try to communicate, we start with a communicative goal, this kind of pre-verbal piece of content that we're trying to pass into someone else's mind. In order to convey meaning, we have to translate our thought to our audience by using the 4 steps of grounding. Like, let's say I want you both to know it's gonna rain later. First, I have to say it without misspeaking, loud enough for you to hear me. Then you both have to be paying attention and successfully hear me. Then the third grounding step is interpretation. We all have to have the same definitions of rain and later.
Right. Like, so are we talking later as in later tonight, or later as in later next week?
Exactly. And that ambiguity is where a lot of miscommunication comes from. But since I'm aware of the steps of grounding, I'll pause to clarify that by later, I mean this evening.
Okay, so by discussing that there's room for me to misinterpret a word, I know to ask for clarification.
Totally. And then the 4th step of grounding is uptake, or belief. Even if you know what I'm trying to say by it's going to rain later, you also have to believe me. If you saw a forecast that said a 0% chance of rain, we'd probably fail the 4th step.
Okay, but how do you actually get someone to agree with you? I feel like at that point, you just acknowledge that you have different pre-existing information and agree to disagree.
Well, remember that every act of communication starts with a goal. So to complete that 4th step of grounding, we can try to figure out why the person we disagree with wants us to believe what they're trying to convey. This could be a place in the conversation to compare weather apps, or see if I was misled by someone else. Maybe there's 2 conflicting forecasts, so we can both learn that neither of us know the weather. Maybe I just want you to close the windows before you leave, to be doubly sure it doesn't rain on the carpet again.
You're never gonna let me live that down, huh?
Okay, so I want a little bit more clarification on this interpretation step. So you're talking about how to make sure we're discussing the same tangible thing. But what if we're talking about something that has different connotations for both of us. If I said I wanted to show you an intense movie, we both know what I literally mean. Maybe it's intense because it deals with grief. But the impact of that intensity, it might be different for both of us.
True. That could make it poignant and powerful to you, while it would probably make it exhausting and not worth watching for me and Marion.
You can't study the cognitive science of language use without studying context. All communication is inherently social. So if your goal is to convince me to watch the movie, you might have to change your strategy once you realize that intensity has a negative connotation for me.
Like maybe the movie has lots of cute dogs that don't die. That'd help convince me.
The way I know what any word means is through the things that I personally associate it with. If I've disliked lots of movies that were described as intense, my snap inference will be that intense means bad. But over time, if I watch more movies that you call intense that I actually like, I might gradually change my interpretation of the word. We can't remove associations from our understanding of a word, but through further exposure, we can add additional meanings and change the weight or prominence in our minds of certain attributes of that word.
So what? We can just never be on the same page about a definition?
Right, but there's nothing wrong with that. Clarification is an essential part of communication. There's no right or wrong way to talk. All that matters is using strategies of communication that are specifically tailored to the people you're talking to.
That's why it's so frustrating when people say that a certain dialect of English is grammatically incorrect. As long as the people speaking to each other are successfully conveying meaning, that's effective communication. Speaking of which, there's some pretty serious political dimensions to all of this. If we're making snap inferences about things like movies, we're definitely making them about groups of people. If someone is raised in a racist community, they'll have such strong prejudices that no single positive experience, and definitely no one chunk of new information, will be able to change their gut reactions.
That's why I think representation matters. If you're homophobic, but you start seeing a bunch of queer characters portrayed positively in different kinds of media, then your strongest view of queer people will slowly change.
But I don't have to necessarily think that those portrayals reflect reality. I mean, that's the fourth step of grounding, right? And I think that's a key downside to representation as a solution. The strength of an association can't just be changed by how many times we hear something. It has to fit in with our previous worldview or come from a source that we trust.
Frustrating, but yeah, I see what you mean.
Also, sure, positive representation can slowly influence the weight of our associations, but so can negative representation, which actually strengthens stereotypes. As long as we give a platform to people preaching hatred, it'll be pretty much impossible to end prejudice.
Right. Linguistically speaking, in its least restricted form, free speech takes away our ability to have fully free thought. Like, if I hear a stereotype, even if I don't believe it, my brain will add the fact that some people do believe it to my list of associations.
Yeah, and oftentimes ideas that build negative connotations aren't even spread intentionally. Like, it's really common to hear that someone's suffering from autism, but autism isn't inherently negative. It can make it more difficult to live in our society, but that's more suffering from cultural expectations. But the association of suffering with autism is so prevalent in our society that people don't even realize that they're spreading a negative stereotype.
And I feel like the internet is making negative ideas even harder to get rid of. Like, if your racist uncle says something upsetting at Thanksgiving, it's gone after the blow-up argument. But if he tweets it, new people can keep reading it weeks or even months later.
Now just imagine if your uncle were somehow the president.
Plus, social media algorithms prioritize paid content, so people with money have a lot more power to spread ideas than the average person. Then those paid posts show up on our feeds right next to our high school friends.
All it takes is a few influencers saying something for it to feel like it's popping up everywhere.
I mean, you don't even need to be an influencer to pop up everywhere. All you have to do is say something ridiculously controversial and social media algorithms will spread it like wildfire. Even if the internet contains more loving, hopeful things than prejudiced or hateful ones, AIs will share the controversial ones more frequently because that generates engagement, which generates ad revenue.
See? That's why I think that introducing AI into situations like this will make things more problematic.
Okay, but I'm actually talking about algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy. If you think about it, it actually says more about the people who designed the AI than the AI itself. For example, lots of facial recognition programs have difficulty identifying black faces, but that's not because the program is dumb or malicious. It's just that the dataset that it's been trained on is dominated by white faces.
Right. Just like us, AIs learn a weighted, probabilistic view of something based on their exposure to it. For both computers and humans, the ideas that you encounter make up your beliefs.
Yeah. I've also seen examples where image captioning AIs have learned to label anyone cooking as a woman. That's not inherent, that's learned sexism. Our fear that AIs will take over and enslave society is really just us being afraid that we would teach them to do that.
I feel like this conversation started in a hopeful place.
Okay, I'm pulling us out of this hole.
Okay. I'm skeptical, but I'm listening.
Okay, so like we talked about, adding associations to a concept is easy. It's just difficult to make something the strongest association.
Yeah. I mean, also, if the most readily accessible image sets are heavily biased and limited in who they portray doing what, it's gonna take a long time and a lot of resources to even out the representation.
Plus, representation alone won't necessarily change minds if they're predisposed to ignore data from certain sources. It's not just about the quantity of data we interpret, but how we are interpreting each piece of data. Basically, you need to go through the grounding steps to pick up a new association.
Right. So yes, let's absolutely work on constructing inclusive image caption sets to train our AIs on. But also, we need to build AIs that can go through the grounding steps before captioning an image. To quote philosopher Jason Stanley, in order to have a truly democratic culture, people need to regularly check themselves for bias and subject their own beliefs and unthinking use of language to the same critical scrutiny as they do the beliefs and utterances of others.
But how do we program a machine to check itself for bias?
We could make a coherence-aware AI. So earlier we were talking about how humans can't help but draw connections between things to help make sense of communication.
Like how you saw the causal relationship in my text.
Exactly. There's actually a whole branch of computational linguistics dedicated to identifying different coherence relations and figuring out the implicit cues that signal them. If we train AIs to look for those implicit signals,
then the AI will be able to understand the implicit overarching meaning of ideas instead of just taking their explicit parts at face value.
And then, if the AI deems something incoherent or inconsistent with its purpose, it won't pass the fourth step of grounding, and it can reject it from its associations about an idea.
Okay, but what does that actually look like?
Okay, so like common sense says that each caption tells you what is in an image, right? Just like common sense says that every word has an objective definition, even though, as we discussed earlier, they're all context dependent. In reality, there's a variety of coherence relationships between images and words. Sometimes the caption is telling you how the picture was taken, and sometimes it's just a subjective opinion about it. Right now, image captioning AIs are largely learning to treat beautiful and after a long day as a part of the visual description of an image, while we as humans know that those descriptions are referring to the communicative goal of the person who captioned the image, not the picture itself.
That makes sense. After all, if even the three of us couldn't agree on what constitutes beautiful, I wouldn't want a program try to interpret that objectively.
And on the other hand, when AIs who haven't been programmed with coherence in mind try to combine individual stimuli into larger chunks of information, they can be prone to context hallucinations, where they perceive a relationship that they identified in one example in every example.
Like when they label everyone who cooks a woman.
Exactly.
Or, even more innocently, an algorithm might label an image of an employee manager, because earlier it processed a similar picture labeled manager, and doesn't realize that that's a context-dependent role, and not just a general term to describe people in a workplace. Coherence-aware AIs can learn that each descriptor is context-dependent, and so it should only use labels that it can find textual evidence for, like a name tag that says manager.
This is a cool dream, but has any of it actually been done successfully?
So far, all of the tests conducted show significantly higher accuracy in captions generated by coherence-aware AIs as compared to programs that aren't made to look for coherence.
I feel like there are a bunch more uses to this than just image captioning.
I mean, earlier I mentioned how adjectives in sign languages can be dictated by gesture speed instead of just unique gestures. Teaching AIs to also look for information in gesture speed enables accurate translations of sign languages far beyond what coherence-ignorant AIs have ever been capable of. So with this technology, people who primarily communicate through sign languages could use the internet without having to translate themselves into written languages.
And there's powerful offline implications of this too. We could actually use coherence-aware AIs to help interpret between lawyers and incarcerated people who have to make use of the public defender system. If people only get 30 minutes with a state-appointed lawyer, they shouldn't have to use any of that time trying to translate themselves into legal jargon.
But, I mean, this definitely isn't a cure-all. We still have to do the work as individuals and as a culture to learn the linguistic skills necessary to check ourselves for biases and ask for clarification. Obviously, we should make the legal system accessible enough that people don't have to translate themselves into legal jargon. But I admit that that kind of work might take decades, if not generations, before it can cause systemic change. It's pretty awesome that we can start using these AI solutions much sooner.
I guess the Terminator got it wrong. We shouldn't fear robots, we should fear people building them carelessly or with malicious intent. It seems like the robots themselves could help us build a more empathetic world.
I guess we have to start changing the strength of our associations about AI.
We also need to start changing our assumptions about the people working on these things. We need to amplify the stories of the countless invaluable marginalized scientists of the world. And I want to highly encourage people of all identities to come join us in this field. We can break down the stereotypes and be the positive data set that we want to see in the world.
Which is a great recipe for humanitarian progress. You see what I did there?
Full circle. Yes, I've unconsciously identified a recall-coherence relationship.
Seriously though, are you gonna get started on the pie?
Obviously, I've been preoccupied with this conversation.